Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we will be building up the rear section of the XR311, and with any luck we'll get the whole assembly complete by the end of the video. Well, looks like we're going to start with the rear hubs and arms on step 8. There's quite a few bits to dig out. We're going to need 4 bushes, the stub axles, these are the ones with the flat ground in the end, 2 drive cups, 8 long screws for the arms, the 8 plain nuts, which we'll be replacing with nylock so we don't get any Loctite on the plastic. From the trees we'll need the little spacers and the rear hubs. We'll deal with the arms when the hubs are complete. Oh, and we'll need a couple of the little grub screws for the drive cups too. The bushes should press neatly into the hubs. They're a fairly tight fit, but as long as you get them in straight they'll slide straight in. You can test the alignment with one of the stub axles. It should pop straight in without getting hung up. The plastic spacer fits over the stub axle, and we need to apply a nice coat of grease. Insert the axle and spread the grease around a bit. Apply a bit more if anything appears dry. You can always wipe off the excess. If it's dry it'll wear very quickly. The drive cups will need a nice good blob of Loctite. It's all metal so there's no worry about contaminating any plastics. Loosely fit the grub screw and line it up with the flat on the stub axle. We need to make sure the grub is nice and tight. And importantly, we need to set it up so the stub axle has a tiny bit of float. The manual suggests using a bit of card as a spacer, but as long as you can move the shaft in and out a tiny amount, it'll be just fine. The other hub is exactly the same, just make sure the shaft is free to spin with a little bit of float and it will work just fine. The arms are put together exactly the same way as the front ones. A little bit of grease on the pins, put the arms together, then pop the screws and nuts in and do them up. We're using nylocks here so we don't weaken the plastic with any Loctite. And on to step 9, gearbox assembly. This is one of the bits that can cause some issues. We'll need the main gear, gearbox case, 2 bushings, drive cups, drive shaft, a couple of grub screws and a large washer. The first problem we have is getting the bushings into the gear case. They're a very tight fit. Some people might find it tempting to have a good bash at them, a good few thumps with a blunt object. Trouble is, the cast gear case is really rather brittle. Too much force or shock and it'll crack, or if you get it really wrong it'll just shatter. But it does have one advantage. If you warm up the metal it'll expand just enough for the bearings to go in nicely. Ideally you want to put it in a cold oven and let it warm up to 170 degrees C. While the gear case is warming up, you can pop the bushing in the freezer. They'll shrink a little bit, making it even easier. Now, I've not got an oven close by for filming, so I'm going to use a heat gun. Far from ideal as it's tricky to warm it all up evenly, and it'll never get as hot as using an oven, but it'll still help. When it's up to temperature, center the bushing and press it straight down. There's a fair chance it will drop straight in, but be ready to apply a little bit of pressure. Next, grease up the shaft, pass it through the side without the bushing, through the gear, grease up the steel washer and pop it over the shaft, and finally pass the shaft through the bushing. Watch out while doing this, the gear case will hold the heat for quite some time. Flip it over and apply some more grease to the end of the shaft and heat up the whole assembly. The ceramic grease with the kit seems to put up with the high temperature quite nicely. When it's all back up to temperature, drop the bushing over the shaft and gently press it home. All being well, the shaft should spin quite freely, or at least as freely as a bushed gearbox can. Leave it to cool for a bit and install the drive cups. They're the same as the stub axles, bit of Loctite, grub screw and fit them over the ends of the drive shaft. And just like the stubs, make sure you have a little bit of float in the shaft. I found with the cups on all the way there was just about enough. Step 10 next, one end of the gearbox. This one we need the shaft for the bevel gear, a flanged bush and 2 non-flanged small bushes, the bevel gear, thrust washer, E-clip and a couple of nuts. We need one of the gears from the gear bag. Each one is marked, and for this bit we need gear D. From the trees there's a couple of plastic inserts, and of course we need the gearbox plate itself. The shaft just presses into the gear. It needs quite a firm push. I found it went in a little bit further than I expected. The 2 non-flanged bushes need to get pressed into the plate, one on each side, and as always make sure you press them in nice and straight. Lube up the shaft and pop it in. It shouldn't catch on the way through. If it does, adjust the bushes as necessary. On the inside face, add an extra blob of grease on the bush face and drop the thrust washer over the shaft. Slot in the E-clip and clip it in with some pliers. Add another bit of grease around the clip and give it a spin. You should see the grease getting nicely spread out. Now these bits are rather neat. In the bottom corners there are 2 holes for the M2 nuts. Drop one in, make sure it's laying flat on the bottom, and insert one of the plastic posts in behind it. Instant captured nut. So much nicer than the usual self-tappers used for gearbox covers. I like that a lot. The bevel gear slides over the splines on the shaft. You could add a little bit of grease to the splines, but it's not going to matter too much. It should slide on far enough to fit the flange bearing on the end. The shaft should be flush with the end of the bush, or even ever so slightly sticking out. If the shaft is below the bush, it's going to put pressure on the bearing mount in the metal gearbox, and possibly crack it. You can, if you're careful, take a little bit of material off the back face of the bevel gear to adjust the clearance. The usual figure 8 pattern on some soapy wet and dry paper will do the trick. In this one we're going to seal up the gearbox. Step 11. This time we need some plain nuts, as I don't think the nylocks are going to fit for this one. The last of the long screws, drive shafts, bulkhead, and the arms we built earlier. All the suspension pins need a smear of grease, as well as a bit in the drive cups. It's going to attract grit like nothing else, so we'll need to keep an eye on the cups and make sure the grease doesn't get too gritty. The arms are a very nice positive fit on the pins. The only tricky bit is lining everything up without losing a drive shaft. The pins on this side need a little bit of grease too. Then the bulkhead fits neatly in place. To hold it all together we're going to use the 4 long screws. I would like to use the nylocks again, but if we skip ahead we can see the rear end mount's going to fit flush to the bulkhead, and unfortunately the nylocks are going to stick out a little bit, so we'll have to stick with the kit plain nuts and some Loctite. For all 4 of the screws, spin on the nuts, loosely do them up so the nuts seat in their recesses. Now we can do the Loctite trick. Pop a little bit on the threads next to the nut, loosen the screw and retighten it. It should spread the Loctite quite nicely. One thing to note, I found the tightness of these screws greatly affected the mesh between the internal gears. If you do them up too tight, you can start to make them bind. I ended up doing them up so they were just bottomed out, then another 1/8 of a turn. The assembly feels nice and solid, and the gears spin nice and freely. After a bit of running, what remains of the stickiness should free up quite nicely. Next we get to do one of those milestone bits of any build, fitting the motor. Some exciting stuff for step 12. Not many bits for this one. 4 M3 nylocks, 2 M3 screws and an M2 nut. There's the mounting plate and the little plastic bung. The aluminium plate fits over the end of the screws and 4 nylocks go on the ends. It's a bit fiddly, but we need to keep the screws from rotating with a screwdriver while we do up the nuts. A stubby driver would probably make this a lot easier. The M2 nut drops into a nice little recess in the top of the motor mount. Make sure it's in there flat, and the plastic bung goes in behind it, making the 3rd mount for the gear cover. The motor gets offered up to the mount, and when the holes are aligned the 2 screws go in. There's no meshing to worry about here, it's all fixed position. The screws are done up nice and tight without any Loctite. I do rather like how modular this build is. Last step for today, step 13, a good one to end on. This time you're going to need 3 M2 screws, grub screw, flanged bearings, the pinion, shaft and the gear cover. We also need a gear, but there's a choice of 3. The model was originally designed for 4 alkaline cells, so roughly 6 volts. We're going to be running on a 6L9 my pack, which will be around 7.2 volts. So, to keep the wheel speed down, I'm going to start with a slow gear. I'm thinking it will still run fast enough and have more than enough torque. If it's a bit too slow, we can always change it for the medium gear later. Press one of the flange bushes into the appropriate hole, making sure it's fully seated. Same with the gear cover, making sure it's nice and flat. Apply some grease to the bushes, insert the shaft, bit more grease, slide the gear on. It should spin nice and smoothly. Insert the pinion so the teeth are nicely in line with the gear. Do up the grub screw nice and tight. The manual wants us to grease all the gears, so a nice layer over the teeth will do the job. When it's up and running it will fling off any excess grease, so we might need to have a wipe around after the first run. The gear cover goes on now, held on with the 3 M2 screws. And there we go, another very neat little unit. Just like the front, I don't think it would pass for a modern kit. Too many bits that need special attention. And well, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, like if you liked, and by all means subscribe if you're not already. You might just get notified when the next video goes up if you do. Well, bye guys.